Sarah Martinez was no ordinary journalist. For 15 years, she had been digging deep into stories that most reporters would shy away from, working tirelessly at the Chicago Tribune to expose the hidden injustices that plagued their city's legal system. Her colleagues knew her as someone who would chase a story relentlessly, especially when it came to uncovering discrimination in the courts. On that fateful autumn morning, the crisp air carried a hint of change as Sarah parked her car outside the courthouse. She had an important meeting with a source about a developing story, and she made sure to carefully pay for parking through the city's official app. Double-checking the payment confirmation on her phone, she hurried inside for her meeting. 2 hours later, as Sarah returned to her car, her heart sank. A bright orange parking ticket was fluttering under her windshield wiper. She grabbed it, confusion and anger rising as she read the violation. This made no sense. She had proof of payment right on her phone. The timestamps clearly showed she had paid for the entire duration. As she stood there studying the ticket, Sarah's reporter instincts kicked in. Something felt off about this situation. She had heard whispers about unfair ticketing practices in this area, particularly targeting certain groups. Looking around, she noticed several other cars with tickets and couldn't help but observe a pattern in which vehicles were being cited. Instead of simply paying the fine or filing a routine appeal, Sarah decided to handle this personally. She would appear in traffic court herself. What started as a simple parking ticket was about to become something much bigger, though she didn't know it yet. That evening, at her small but cozy apartment filled with case files and news clippings, Sarah began preparing her defense. She meticulously gathered her evidence, screenshots of the parking payment, time-stamped photos of her car, and the parking regulations for that area. As she worked late into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that this incident might be connected to the larger story she had been investigating about judicial bias in the city's courts. Little did she know that her upcoming appearance in traffic court would not only change her life, but would also spark an investigation that would shake the foundations of Chicago's justice system. As she finally went to bed that night, the parking ticket sat on her desk, an innocent-looking piece of paper that would soon become the first domino in a much larger story of prejudice, power, and the pursuit of justice. The next time she would see a judge about this ticket, she would walk into the courtroom not just as someone contesting a citation, but with her sharp reporter's mind already piecing together a story that was much bigger than a simple parking violation. The courthouse would never see it coming. As Sarah walked into the bustling traffic court that morning, the tension in the air was palpable. The room was packed with defendants, most of them people of color, all waiting their turn before Judge Michael Whitman. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the worn wooden benches where people sat nervously clutching their tickets and paperwork. Judge Whitman sat high on his bench, his silver hair and stern expression making him look more like a disapproving grandfather than a judge. Sarah noticed how he barely made eye contact with defendants as he rapidly processed case after case. His voice carried a tone of bored irritation, as if each person before him was simply wasting his valuable time. When Sarah's case was called, she approached the bench confidently, her evidence ready on her phone. "Your Honor, I have proof of payment through the city's parking app," she began, her voice clear and professional. But before she could even finish her sentence, Judge Whitman raised his hand dismissively. "I don't need to see your phone," he interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension. The officer issued a valid citation. The fine stands. He barely glanced at the documentation Sarah tried to present, instead shuffling through papers on his bench as if she wasn't even there. Sarah felt her journalistic instincts kicking into high gear. She noticed how differently the judge treated the few white defendants who appeared before him. His tone softened, he made eye contact, and he actually listened to their explanations. The contrast was striking and unmistakable. "Your Honor, with all due respect," Sarah persisted, "the evidence clearly shows." But Judge Whitman cut her off again, this time his face reddening with anger. "Ms. Martinez, you will pay a fine of $500, he announced, hammering his gavel with unnecessary force. The amount was shocking, 5 times the standard fee for a parking violation. The courtroom fell silent, and Sarah could feel all eyes on her. "If you continue to argue," Judge Whitman added with a sneer, "I will hold you in contempt of court. Do you understand?" His threat hung heavy in the air, but Sarah noticed something else too. He seemed to enjoy this display of power, especially when exercised against certain defendants. As she left the courtroom that day, Sarah's mind was already racing. She wasn't just angry about the unfair fine. She was thinking like an investigative reporter. This wasn't just about one parking ticket or one biased judge anymore. She had just stumbled into what could be the biggest story of her career, and Judge Whitman had no idea he had just given her the final piece of evidence she needed. Looking back at the courthouse steps, Sarah pulled out her reporter's notebook and began jotting down everything she had observed. The seeds of an explosive investigation were already taking root in her mind. The confrontation in the courtroom that day was just the beginning. Sarah's blood was still boiling as she stood outside, her $500 fine notice crumpled in her trembling hand. Other defendants who had witnessed the scene began approaching her, their voices low but urgent. "That's nothing new for Judge Whitman," whispered an elderly black woman. "He does this to us all the time." More people gathered around, each with their own story of unfair treatment. Sarah pulled out her phone and started recording their testimonies, her reporter's instincts taking over. One young mother tearfully described how a simple parking ticket had snowballed into nearly $1,000 in fines, forcing her to choose between paying rent or paying the court. A college student shared how he had to drop out because Judge Whitman's excessive fines drained his tuition savings. As Sarah listened, she noticed court officers watching the growing crowd with suspicion. She quickly exchanged contact information with several people before they dispersed. Just then, her phone buzzed. It was her editor, Tom, wondering where she was. Back at the Tribune office, Sarah burst into Tom's office, her eyes blazing with purpose. "Remember that story I was working on about systemic bias in traffic court?" she said, dropping her own court papers on his desk. "Well, I just became part of it." Tom leaned forward, intrigued, as Sarah recounted the morning's events. His expression grew serious as she played the recordings from outside the courthouse. "This isn't just about a parking ticket anymore," she explained. "Judge Whitman is systematically targeting minorities with excessive fines." But when Sarah suggested going public with the story immediately, Tom raised his hand. "We need more than anecdotes," he cautioned. "If we're going after a judge, we need hard evidence. Numbers, patterns, documentation." Sarah nodded, understanding the challenge ahead. They would need to analyze thousands of cases, compile statistics, and document the disparities. It would take months of careful investigation. As she left Tom's office, Sarah passed the wall displaying the Tribune's past Pulitzer Prizes. She paused, looking at her reflection in the glass. Judge Whitman's contemptuous expression flashed in her mind. He thought he had put her in her place that morning, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. Sarah Martinez wasn't just any defendant. She was an investigative reporter with the resources of a major newspaper behind her, and she was about to shine a very bright light on his courtroom. She turned away from the display case and headed to her desk. The real work was about to begin. Sarah dove deep into her investigation, transforming her small cubicle at the Tribune into a command center. Stacks of court records surrounded her desk, and her computer screen glowed with spreadsheets filled with data from thousands of traffic court cases. She had spent weeks meticulously documenting every decision Judge Whitman had made over the past 3 years. The patterns began emerging like pieces of a disturbing puzzle. The numbers were staggering. Black defendants were paying fines averaging $350 for parking violations, while white defendants paid around $75 for identical infractions. Sarah cross-referenced dates, times, locations, and violations, building an airtight case showing systematic discrimination. Late one night, as she was reviewing security footage from the courthouse, Sarah noticed something else. Judge Whitman's body language and tone drastically changed depending on who stood before him. With white defendants, he was patient and understanding. With minorities, particularly black women, his demeanor became hostile and dismissive. Sarah started receiving anonymous tips from courthouse employees. A clerk slipped her a USB drive containing internal emails showing Judge Whitman joking about teaching certain people lessons. A former bailiff agreed to be interviewed, describing how the judge would often make racist remarks in private. The deeper she dug, the more disturbing the story became. Some victims of Whitman's bias had lost their jobs because they couldn't pay the excessive fines. Others had their licenses suspended, making it impossible to work. Families were being pushed into poverty by a system that was supposed to serve justice. Tom, her editor, watched with growing concern as Sarah worked through weekends and late nights. "You need to be careful," he warned one evening. "Judges have powerful friends." But Sarah couldn't stop. Each new piece of evidence fueled her determination to expose the truth. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Sarah discovered connections between Judge Whitman and several local business owners. These businesses consistently reported parking violations in minority neighborhoods, and their complaints always seemed to end up in Whitman's courtroom. As she organized her findings, Sarah realized she wasn't just uncovering one biased judge. She was exposing an entire network of systemic racism hidden behind the facade of justice. The story was bigger than she had imagined, and it was almost ready to be told. Copy. The evidence against Judge Whitman grew more damning with each passing day. Sarah's investigation revealed a disturbing pattern spanning over 5 years. The spreadsheets on her desk told a shocking story. While white defendants had an 85% chance of having their tickets dismissed, black defendants faced a mere 15% chance, regardless of evidence. Sarah interviewed over 200 people affected by Whitman's bias rulings. Mary Johnson, a single mother, lost her nursing job after being unable to pay a $750 fine for a broken taillight. James Carter, a college student, had to drop out when Whitman's excessive fines drained his tuition savings. Each story added another layer to the investigation. The turning point came when a courthouse whistleblower provided access to Judge Whitman's private communications. Emails revealed him mocking minority defendants and coordinating with certain police officers to target specific neighborhoods. In one particularly damning message, he bragged about keeping certain elements in line through aggressive fining. Sarah's analysis revealed a disturbing financial pattern too. The neighborhoods most heavily targeted by Whitman's excessive fines were predominantly black communities. The total amount extracted from these areas exceeded $2.5 million over 3 years, money that had devastated already struggling families. More courthouse staff began coming forward. A court reporter shared recordings where Whitman made racist comments during breaks. A clerk provided documents showing how he routinely overruled evidence presented by minority defendants while accepting similar evidence from white defendants. Working late one night, Sarah discovered something that made her hands shake. Judge Whitman sat on the board of a private probation company that profited from payment plans forced on defendants who couldn't pay their fines. The connection was clear. The more excessive the fines, the more profit for the company. The final piece fell into place when Sarah obtained security footage showing Whitman having private meetings with police officers before court sessions, discussing which defendants to make examples of. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't just bias, it was a calculated system of discrimination. As she organized her findings into a comprehensive report, Sarah knew this story would shake the foundations of Chicago's justice system. The data was irrefutable, the testimonies heartbreaking, and the paper trail damning. Judge Whitman's days of using his power to discriminate were numbered. The Chicago Tribune's front page on that cold Monday morning sent shockwaves through the city. Justice E for SAL. Systemic racism exposed in Chicago traffic court blazed across the top, accompanied by Sarah's meticulous investigation findings. The story quickly became the most read article in the Tribune's digital history. Within hours, Judge Whitman's courtroom sat empty as news crews swarmed the courthouse steps. TV reporters quoted directly from Sarah's expose, highlighting the stark statistics. Black defendants paying 5 times more in fines than white defendants for identical violations, the secret deals with probation companies, and the damning private emails. Social media exploded with the story. People began sharing their own experiences with Judge Whitman, using hashtag #JusticeForSal. Civil rights organizations called for immediate action, and prominent law lawyers offered to represent victims of Whitman's discriminatory practices pro bono. The State Judicial Review Board called an emergency meeting. By noon, they announced Judge Whitman's immediate suspension pending investigation. His face, once smug with power, now appeared ashen on the evening news as reporters cornered him leaving the courthouse. Members of Congress from Illinois cited Sarah's investigation during a hearing on judicial reform. The Department of Justice announced it would conduct its own investigation into systemic racism in traffic courts nationwide. Sarah's story had touched a nerve that resonated far beyond Chicago. Local community leaders organized protests demanding reviews of all Whitman's past rulings. Families affected by his discriminatory fines shared their stories on national television. The Tribune's website crashed repeatedly as millions sought to read the full investigation. What started as a simple parking ticket had exposed one of the largest scandals in Chicago's judicial history. Sarah's phone rang constantly with calls from national news outlets, civil rights attorneys, and even Hollywood producers interested in turning her investigation into a documentary. But for Sarah, the most powerful moment came when Mary Johnson, the nurse who had lost her job due to Whitman's excessive fines, called to say she had been offered her position back. The hospital had read the story and understood she had been a victim of judicial discrimination. Real change was happening, one life at a time. The aftermath of Sarah's investigation brought sweeping changes to Chicago's judicial system. Judge Whitman faced criminal charges for corruption and civil rights violations. The Judicial Review Board's comprehensive audit revealed over 15,000 cases tainted by discriminatory rulings. The state legislature passed the Judicial Accountability Act, requiring monthly audits of court fines and introducing racial bias training for all judges. The law, nicknamed the Martinez Reform, became a model for other states. Sarah's investigative series won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service Journalism. During her acceptance speech, she shared the stage with families whose lives had been impacted by Whitman's discrimination. Their stories of recovery and resilience moved the audience to tears. The Chicago Traffic Court underwent a complete overhaul. A diverse panel of judges replaced the old guard. New technology was implemented to track and flag disparities in sentencing. A community oversight board was established to monitor judicial conduct. The private probation company linked to Whitman was shut down, and millions in illegally collected fines were ordered to be repaid. A class action lawsuit resulted in a $10 million settlement for victims of discriminatory fines. Local law schools began using Sarah's investigation as a case study in legal ethics courses. Her methodology for uncovering systemic racism became a blueprint for investigative journalists nationwide. Most importantly, thousands of lives were transformed. James Carter returned to college on a full scholarship. Mary Johnson not only got her nursing job back, but was promoted to department supervisor. The community that had suffered under Whitman's reign began to heal and rebuild. Sarah continued her work, mentoring young journalists and advocating for judicial reform. Her parking ticket, now framed in her office, served as a reminder that sometimes the biggest stories start with the smallest injustices. The change she sparked continued to ripple through the justice system, ensuring that true equality under the law wasn't just a phrase, but a reality.